On the building up front, Julian turned his attention first to building up in the literal sense. He ordered all the old shrines and temples and sanctuaries that had been closed over the years to be reopened, and appropriated imperial funds to help defray the costs. But, knowing that the central government would not be able to afford to cover even a fraction of the total costs that this order would generate, Julian issued an addendum edict that was one part practical and one part punitive. Under the previous Christian regimes, the citizens had been encouraged to destroy the blasphemous sanctuaries of the pagans, or, at the very least, to repurpose them into something more useful. So all these old pagan buildings became shops and warehouses, and in some cases, family apartments. Julian ordered that the men responsible for the destruction or repurposing of the temple be responsible for the costs of undoing the damage they had done. Even Julian's most ardent admirers are troubled by the real-world effects of this edict. The empire had been Christian for 40 years now, so in many cases, families and businesses had absorbed the old pagan holy places a really long time ago. Their lives and livelihoods had become tied, at imperial encouragement no less, to the discarded husks of what they had been assured were dead cults. Now, suddenly, Julian wanted to kick them out and make them pay to rebuild the houses of said dead cults. It was unfair in theory, and cruel in practice. But Julian pushed on undeterred, and in February of 362, about 4 months after donning the purple, he issued his famous, or infamous, depending on who you talk to, Edict on Religious Tolerance. The point of the edict was to officially overturn the anti-pagan laws that had been on the books since the reign of Constantine. Now, those laws, which banned sacrifice, had never been uniformly or even diligently enforced, but still, officially they were out there, and so Julian officially cancelled them. Using the same sort of language Constantine had once used himself in the Edict of Milan, Julian declared that all religions were now to be considered equal in the eyes of the government. This meant that all the secret pagans or lapsed pagans or whoever could now return to their old ways without fear of state sanction. It also meant, though, that Christianity was not illegal. Given everything we know about Julian the Apostate, one might assume that the first thing he did was ban the Galilean religion outright. But his plans were a bit more subtle, a bit more long-term, and a bit more rational than his name might imply. The utter failure of the Great Persecution was not exactly ancient history. Julian knew that, far from breaking the Christians, that violent repression only led to a hardening of their resolve. So his edict was designed to unleash upon them their very worst and most hated enemy in all the world: other Christians. Julian's Edict of Toleration meant that the 40-year-old policy of using imperial muscle to back up what, for lack of a better word, I'll call mainstream Christianity, was over. All those repressed heresies were now free to come out of the woodwork and preach their own particular brand of the one true faith. Just at the moment when the Christian community needed to unite in the face of Julian's attacks, its ranks were sowed with discord. In Julian's perfect world, he would never have to do anything so dramatic as destroy Christianity. Instead, they would just slowly but surely tear themselves apart. Probably the nicest thing about this toleration strategy was that it enabled Julian to maintain the moral high ground. He pointedly declared that no religious violence would be accepted, no matter who the perpetrator or who the victim. Pagans were not to attack Christians. Christians were not to attack pagans, and Christians were not to attack each other. Thus, Julian was able to avoid being painted as some monster, a la Galerius or Maximinus Daia. Because I just want everyone to get along. What's wrong with everyone getting along? Come on, can't we all just get along? But just because he encouraged non-violent means of achieving his goal, that did not mean that Julian's goal was not to drive Christianity into the ground. His goal, most definitely, was to drive Christianity into the ground. In May of 362, Julian left Constantinople and headed for Antioch. Since he had originally established his bona fides in the west, it was important for the new emperor to reach out to the eastern provinces and consolidate his rule over the whole empire. The East, after all, had been Constantius's domain for almost a quarter of a century, and Julian had come to power in the middle of a revolt against the man the eastern provincials had happily called Augustus all those years. In other words, Julian had some making up to do. On top of this political rationale, Julian also had a military rationale for heading east. The war with the Persians that Constantius had broken off was still hanging out there unresolved, and Julian wanted to use that war to cement his imperial authority. A big win over the Persians would catapult him to a whole new level. Not only would he earn the respect of the Eastern legions, who had just months before been marching out to crush him, but he would also establish himself as a military leader of unparalleled skill. He could already add major victories in the east, and boy, he might just become bigger than Constantine. On the road to Antioch, Julian issued another one of his famous/infamous anti-Christian edicts. Henceforth, Christians would not be allowed to teach children using any of the classical texts. That meant no Homer, no Cicero, no Plato. But of course, the basic curriculum of Roman education, philosophy and grammar and rhetoric, used all of those works as their standard textbooks. If you can't teach Homer, you can't teach grammar. It's just that simple. The edict thus presented the parents of the empire with a stark choice. Their kids could either be taught by Christian teachers, but be denied the standard education, or they could be given the standard education and be denied any Christian interpretation of the material. Since a classical education was still required if you wanted to have any sort of decent career, Julian was banking that the vast majority of parents would choose to abandon Christian teachers rather than have their children grow up not knowing who Achilles was. To put this another way, Julian passed a law essentially strangling off Christian access to impressionable young minds. Like I say, he wanted to drive Christianity into the ground. When he arrived in Antioch in July of 362, though, Julian finally ran into some pushback to all this. He came into the eastern capital under the mistaken assumption that the city was eager to shed its Christian veneer and return to its pagan roots. But that was really not the case, as the fracas over the nearby temple of Apollo would make abundantly clear. Julian went to visit the famous temple shortly after his arrival, and was dismayed at the dilapidated condition he found it in. When he ordered a priest to join him at the site for a sacrifice, he was further incensed to see the disinterested priest wandering up with a leftover goose to offer Apollo, rather than a nice fat bull. Julian then consulted the oracle of the temple in order to gain some much-needed mystical advice, but was told that as long as the dead were desecrating the temple grounds, that the oracle could not speak. In this case, the dead referred to a famous Christian martyr who had been buried near the temple grounds. Julian figured it would be no big deal to exhume the body and then move it back to a proper cemetery, but the citizens of Antioch were outraged at this sacrilege. They came out en masse to protest the emperor's decision, and then, just a few days later, the Temple of Apollo mysteriously burned down. The verdict of history is that the fire was probably an accident, caused when some lit candles were neglected. But the verdict of Julian was that the Christians of Antioch were guilty of arson. All of this growing enmity was further exacerbated by another bout of famine, just like the one that had helped take down Julian's brother Gallus. The emperor attempted to set price controls on the now scarce grain supply. But all that happened was that rich merchants bought up all the available food at the controlled price and then carted it off to the surrounding countryside, where they sold it at an insane markup. Between the religious conflict, the famine, and the just downright incompatibility of Julian and the Antiochians, they liked sumptuous living and games, he liked plain living and philosophy, it soon became clear that this was a relationship that was just never going to work. At a set of games thrown by Julian, against his will of course, the Antiochians went in for a particularly harsh round of heckling that left the emperor embarrassed and embittered. He responded by publicly disseminating a satirical work called The Beard Hate, in which he viciously lampooned the citizens of Antioch while pretending to make fun of himself. No one really comes off well in the exchange, and the final upshot of it all is that when the emperor finally left the city in March 363, he promised never to return. His encounter with the Antiochians, though, did not cause him to reassess his religious policies, so much as cause him to dig in his heels. In January of 363, Christians were banned from practicing law. In February, the Christian custom of daytime funerals was prohibited. But as I said, Julian was not just about tearing down. In the middle of all this, he also made an energetic, if futile, attempt to unify all the various pagan cults into a single organized religion, something that could structurally compete with Christianity. Julian could see how the empire-wide network of Christians helped cement its place in the hearts and minds of the citizens, how their dedication to helping the poor, tending to the sick, and offering sanctuary to the lost made them so popular with the common people. And most of all, how their unity, despite their many differences, made them an institutional force to be reckoned with. So Julian tried to create a pagan alternative to the Christian church. According to his plans, high priests would act as bishops, lower priests would act as presbyters and deacons, and social outreach would become a central part of everyone's religious duties. The emperor even made a hurried stab at creating an overarching metaphysical, philosophical framework for all these cults to live in together. But it was a hopeless cause, because, first of all, the emperor did not have time to properly flesh out his ideas. Second, maybe he didn't have the intellectual chops to even pull it off had he had the time. And third, was a position paper really going to suddenly bind together religious cults that had never had anything to do with each other? There was no such thing as capital P paganism. It's just a word that we use to describe a collection of practices and traditions that had all built up independently of each other over time. You can't just throw them all together and say, now you're just one thing. Julian wanted the final fight to be versus traditional polytheism. But the very nature of that polytheism precluded the emperor's vision from ever becoming a reality. It was always going to be Christianity versus a whole bunch of small, disunited cults. But whether it would have worked or not doesn't really matter. When I say Julian did not have the time to properly flesh out his ideas, I don't just mean that he was really busy and didn't have time to focus on philosophy. As I'm sure you know, Julian is about to die and leave all of this work